back here and have this chance to participate in this conference. What I'd like to, let me explain at least the first part of the title here, because this is relevant to what I'll talk about tomorrow, which is about what is affectionately known sometimes as the Ox. Richard Taruskin's 6-volume history of Western music that was published in 2005. It was about a 13-year project for Richard to write this massive history, and in the following year I was asked to turn it into a 1-volume textbook for college and university students. So, and next month, the second edition of the book, which is a little bit thinner and a little bit more student-friendly, will be coming out. So, I wanted to talk about some of the things I did before and after taking on this project. And it occurred to me that in some ways I was sort of well positioned to do such a big history because I'm a generalist in many respects. I teach at a small liberal arts college, Bard-colleджа, which is familiar to many of you, and I teach courses over all periods and different genres. I don't concentrate on my specialty, which is German music, the 19th century, because really there are not many musicologists that teach there, and so we have to teach a wide variety of things. And as well, each year I am the co-director of the Bard Music Festival that focuses on the world of one composer. It began in 1990 with Brahms. Last summer we did Chopin in his world. This summer is Rimsky-Korsakov in his world. Marina Filippo-Walker is our scholar in residence for the year, helping us put this festival together. So every year I'm sort of generally involved with immersing myself in the world of a specific composer. And then in yet sort of another life that I lead as a public musicologist, I write a great many program notes. For the past 18 years, I write every week for the Philadelphia Orchestra. And so this is something that, you know, I've written notes for every Beethoven, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Mahler symphony and so forth. And so, in other words, I'm very used to writing a lot about things I don't know a lot about, just doing this in sort of a generalist way. And that's what I guess we would say, and I think the expression is the same, of seeing the big picture, getting the big picture of something, not being too preoccupied with the details or distracted by the details, but trying to make larger connections and tell stories in this way. So in some respects, all of this is something that I'm committed to as a teacher and as somebody sort of reaching out to a public, and something that I think is very important. And yet when Olga invited me to come to this and to talk a little bit about my own work, it occurred to me that it's almost exactly the opposite of everything I've done since an undergraduate to what my current project is, which is actually looking at the small picture and trying to pay attention to the small picture. So that's why I sort of was talking about microhistories today. This is something of a technical term that's sometimes used by historians, not music historians, but some Italians like Carlo Ginzburg and the Annales School in France and so forth, that did focus on very, very small issues, the life of somebody in the Middle Ages, the life of one person as a window to something much bigger, and focusing on these details as something that could be illuminating of larger picture. And in some respects, that's what I've done in most of my own work since being in college, since being an undergraduate. My senior thesis was on very Verdi's last opera, Falstaff. And it was called The Cloud of Ford, Continuity and Change in Verdi's Falstaff. And I was looking at, it's probably my favorite opera, so at age 20 I decided to spend a year looking at this piece in a lot of detail, and what interested me was how Verdi, who had come out of retirement sort of 2 times to write this piece in his late 70s, and it premiered when he was 80 years old. And it was, except for his second opera, that he had been a failure at the beginning of his career, Giorno di Regno, why did he write a comedy to end his life, since every opera had ended with everybody dead on the stage? It was because he loved Shakespeare, but also I thought he was looking back at his life and career in the genre of opera in such a loving way that he was sort of making fun of the conventions that he had spent his career working on, of revenge arias and male bonding duets. And he quotes from his own earlier operas in wonderful ways. The Bardolph and Pistol, who are Falstaff's henchmen, praised enormous Falstaff to the exact same music in the same key as in Aida. They talk about immensa fa, the great god. And when Dane Quickly comes in and says, povera donna, these poor women that are in love with Falstaff, that's exactly what Violetta says before she sings Sempre Libera, that she's a poor woman in Paris. And on and on. He's quoting himself quite consciously, and also Rossini, and also Wagner, and also Mozart. So he's sort of looking back on his life and career. So that was sort of the first micro-history I did. And the second was my dissertation at Columbia. And this was a reception history on Schubert's Opus 1. I guess I did Verdi's last work and sort of Schubert's first work, The Presence of Erlkönig, reception and reworkings of a Schubert lead. And so I spent some 4 years and 400 pages on a 4-minute long song. I thought that this was a piece that in some ways, since it had made Schubert's name and fame, as I say, it was published as his Opus 1, he had written, of course, hundreds and hundreds of pieces before it, that it is the piece that made him famous. It was arranged by almost for every instrument, and by famous composers like Liszt, who did a piano transcription and orchestrated it, and Berlioz, who orchestrated it, and so forth. So I looked in great detail on this as reception history. When I first proposed it, I remember that my potential dissertation advisor said, that's not really a very good topic. I mean, one song, one 4-minute long song, I mean, come on. And I said, this is genreism and sizeism. If I had said I wanted to do a reception history of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or Tristan and Isolde, or The Rite of Spring, you would say, fine, except people have already done it. And I'm wanting to do this piece that really changed the history of the German lead, that made this young composer one of the most famous figures of the 19th century. And he said, okay, so do it. And 4 or 5 years later, it was done, and sort of vindicated that looking at this small piece as a lens into how did Schubert make his name and fame was something that could be quite interesting way of approaching Schubert, instead of from the wide angle to start with something very small. And then for each year the Bard Festival publishes a book that Princeton University releases. Marina's editing it this year, and sometimes I've asked to write a chapter in that. And they've also been on very small things. I even ventured with Shostakovich, and I don't speak a word of Russian, but I was fascinated by the reception of his 7th Symphony in America. that was an incredibly important event, what Aaron Copland called the phenomenon of the seventh. And when Toscanini finally conducted the premiere in July 1942, after a big battle of all the leading conductors, Tchaikovsky and Kusevitsky and others, but Toscanini was the one who won, it put Shostakovich on the cover of Time magazine that week in Leningrad, on the roofs and being engaged. And so this was a case study that I wasn't looking at the Russian story of this, but actually what happened in America. How did this performance come about? Why was it Toscanini that was conducting? What was the reaction of the American press? And then it was performed in every major orchestra did it within the next 6 months in America. And so I contacted every orchestra that performed it and their archives, and I looked into the reception in very, very specific detail of sort of the first 6 months of this symphony in America. And what did that say about the political relationship between America and the Soviet Union, about the role of music? I mean, it's inconceivable almost that a classical composer now would be of such importance in a political dimension. And so that was another case study. When we did Liszt in his world in 2006, I did a chapter that I had known about and an issue that I was interested in because of Liszt's piano transcription of Erlkönig. And I knew that Liszt played it in almost every concert he gave, because I had been studying the programs of Liszt's concertizing and reworkings, and I began to see when it wasn't on the programs anymore, that meant I learned from reviews that it was an encore. So he was still playing it almost every place. And so I got interested in when he started his career traveling as a virtuoso rock star. The first for the keyboard, really. He was modeling himself on Paganini, who had done this beginning in 1828 for a few years. Liszt's rock tour was 1838 to 1848, and it began in Vienna in the spring of 1838 when he went there to give a benefit concert for a flood in Budapest. And so that was the sort of initial thing that interested me, and then I saw that he stayed on and on and on, and he gave more and more concerts and became more and more famous, and really the apparatus of fame began to emerge around him, with lithographs being sold and, you know, the press covering his every move. And it turned out that two other really important pianists were there at exactly the same time. Clara Wieck, who was 18 years old at the time, and Sigismund Thalberg, another virtuoso. And so there was sort of the battle of the virtuoso pianists. And so really looking at what was about 5 weeks in the spring of 1838, the way these pianists were related, the programs they gave, the exact, I was able to find almost every program and published them. So what was their repertory? What types of things did they do? How did the press respond to it? And in the process of doing this, it's sort of a fascinating case study, but again, it shows sort of larger things. I began to realize that some of the modern biographers of Liszt, and this is relevant to that we fall in love with, or our transferential relationship with the figures we write about, were really distorting what had happened of Liszt during these time there, because although he initially gave that first concert to raise money for flood victims, he soon began to give all these concerts to raise money for himself. And I was pretty sure that the biographers knew this, that the other concerts were not for the benefit of victims, but for Liszt's own benefit. And so it sort of exposed some of the problems of Liszt biographers. And as well, he was breaking up with Marie Dagout, the father of his 3 children, including Cosima Liszt von Bülow-Wagner, eventually Wagner's second wife. So there was even a nice gossip level of what was happening during this time. So that was another one of these sort of micro-histories. And then really what I've, before the Ox, took a good bit of 10 years of, the past 10 years of my life. I've been focusing on an aspect of Schubert that fascinated me because I was involved, again, with sort of with public musicology. There was a project in New York from 1987 to 1997, Schubert's bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of his birth was in 1997, and there was a fantastic and really crazy project in New York to play every note that Schubert wrote in chronological order that Hermann Frey, the great German baritone, started. And so I was involved with that project, and as we reached the end, I wanted to reconstruct the one concert that Schubert gave in his lifetime on March 26, 1828. This is the one public concert in Vienna devoted entirely to his own compositions. And so we were able to do that. I'll show you the program in a few minutes. And in the course of just thinking about this concert, various things occurred to me, and I apologize that some of you have heard this before, but since I've been obsessed for this with 20 years now, I keep on returning to it and working on it. So this concert was given on March 26, 1828. On March 26, 1827 was the day Beethoven died. And I came to believe that this was, and this concert in part was a sort of secret memorial to Beethoven, and that some of the pieces on the program were written in honor of Beethoven and to mourn the death of Beethoven, but also for Schubert in some ways to claim that he was the next Beethoven. That was sort of my working hypothesis as I put this concert on March 26, 1997 in New York. And so I've been working for 20 years now, really, on the death of Beethoven and how that related to Schubert. So when we did Beethoven in His World in 2000, I wrote an article that looked into this microhistory was the reaction to the death of Beethoven in March 1827. I wanted to see what Schubert did in March 1828, so I wanted to see what was every concert, every memorial piece, every poem, every obituary that was in Vienna when Beethoven died. And these are great projects in part because it gets me a lot of time, spend a lot of time in Vienna. And now one can even find some of this on the internet. Most of the journals, actually, magazines, newspapers of the 1820s have been digitalized. But so I was able to find an enormous amount, I called it performance of grief, because in some ways this came not so long after the death of Princess Diana, and the way that sort of her death was performed in England and elsewhere, of the memorials to her, the music that was played, the poems, the books, the memorial souvenirs and so forth. And I wanted to see what that related to with Beethoven. But ultimately, that was really because I was most interested in what Schubert what Schubert's reaction was. Schubert at this point was himself quite ill. He was 30 years old, and in 1822, 6 years earlier, he had become very, very ill, most likely with syphilis. And so the last 6 years of his life was in quite poor health, and I don't think he felt he would live very long. So as Beethoven, his hero, dies, he also is aware that he himself is dying. And so I ultimately published this article about why I think the centerpiece of Schubert's concert was the E-flat piano trio, Opus 100, was a memorial to Beethoven. So let me see, I will quickly take you through something of the argument here. This is ultimately really what my project is now that the second version of the Aux is done, and that I will be working on for the next few years to bring together all of these things in a monograph. So, as you may know, Vienna is quite a small city, surrounded the inner city here by the so-called Colossus. In the 1820s, a big field that the city wall sort of was protecting the city because of Turkish invasions and so forth. And so in the center, which is where Schubert spent most of his time, as well as Beethoven, there were plenty of opportunities for the two to meet. Of course, Beethoven was born in 1770, Schubert in 1797, so he was 27 years younger, but he spent his entire life in the same city as Beethoven. And yet we don't know what their personal relationship is. You have Schubert's oldest friend saying that they never met, and that when Beethoven died, Schubert regretted that they had never spoken to him. You have Schubert's older brother, in whose apartment Schubert died, saying that they saw each other often, but that he was not Beethoven's student, as some people say. So, you know, this is a typical thing with biography of just anecdotes. There's no hard evidence, there's no letters or anything. There are some Schubert letters where he talks about Beethoven. This is very clear. He revered Beethoven above all other composers. There's evidence that Beethoven knew about Schubert because of the so-called conversation books. When Beethoven's deafness from 1818 to 1827, the way people communicated with him in part was to write down their questions. So we have one-sided conversations with Beethoven. It's a fascinating document, and so we actually know which day of the year there was the question to Beethoven, do you know Schubert's Erlkönig? I was thrilled when I saw that for my dissertation, right? I mean, that's the one piece of Schubert's that's mentioned in the conversation books. It's frustrating that we don't know what Beethoven's answer is because they're one-sided. Sometimes you can infer, if the next comment from the person speaking is, oh, I disagree, I think it's a great piece, then you know how Beethoven responded. But in this instance, we know nothing. There's another thing about Schubert saying, Schubert hides himself. This is right after the syphilis, when he was getting mercury treatment, lost his hair, was really very sick, was in the Allgemeine Krankenhaus, was in the city hospital for some time. And so even Schubert appears in Beethoven's conversation books, but we really don't know about the personal relationship. One of the things that's more solid evidence is Schubert's Opus 10, which is a four-hand piano piece, variations on a French song, that's dedicated to Beethoven from his worshiper and admirer, Franz Schubert. So this is a public declaration of how Schubert, in 1822, as a young man, young emerging composer, his first instrumental work, Opus 1 through 8, were all songs. Opus 9 were dances. This was his first sort of big piece that was published. The other thing that we know something about is connected with Beethoven's death in March 1827. There are, again, conflicting accounts. There's one good friend, Anselm Bittenbrenner, who was the person in the room when Beethoven did actually die at 4:15 in the afternoon on March 26th. Hüttenbrenner later, but this is 40 years later, says, I know as an absolute fact that Professor Schindler, that was Anton Schindler, Beethoven's assistant, Schubert and I visited Beethoven at his sickbed about a week before he died. But again, this is, and Anton Hüttenbrenner was quite a liar in many things. He's the guy who had the manuscript of the Unfinished Symphony in his closet for 40 years in Graz. So it's why the premiere of the Unfinished Symphony was in 1865. So Hüttenbrenner is not very reliable. But we do know that Schubert participated in Beethoven's funeral on the 29th of March. This is sort of, I like to think of it as the New Yorker magazine in Vienna, Der Sammler, the collector, and this is a detailed account of the funeral. And it lists everybody involved, including 36 torchbearers. And every name is there, including Schubert's and the leading poets and performers and singers and so forth in Vienna at the time. So Schubert participated in the funeral. He went to Währing Cemetery, where Beethoven was buried. He heard a very famous funeral oration written by Franz Grillparzer, who was the leading poet, Austrian poet. Goethe was still alive, so Goethe was the greatest German, referred to actually in Grillparzer's address. Grillparzer was a friend of Schubert's and of Beethoven's. So he's hearing his friend, this wonderful poet, Grillparzer's oration about his hero. And one of the lines from the funeral speech is, he was an artist, and who shall rise to stand behind him? So, beside him. So, who will be the next Beethoven? And that's what I sort of wonder. Schubert at the age of 30, himself in ill health, what does he think when Grillparzer is asking who the next Beethoven will be? And it's clear that for some time Schubert had been doing what my friend and colleague John Gingrich calls Schubert's Beethoven project, that he had moved from writing songs and dances and forehand music. He had failed in the realm of opera, which was Rossini's and the Italians' success in Vienna. There was some hope when Weber wrote Der Freischütz that German opera could succeed, but then the Oriente premiered in Vienna in 1824 and was a failure. So Schubert saw that German opera by Weber couldn't succeed, so his own operas did not succeed. And so he turned to writing big string quartets, the octet, big projects. So in the most famous letter Schubert ever wrote, he said that he had written 3 string quartets and an octet, and he planned to pave the way toward a grand symphony in that manner. And that's what he wrote the following year, the great C major 9th Symphony. So he had this all in mind. In that same letter, he signs off to his friend. The latest in Vienna is that Beethoven is to give a concert at which he'll produce his new symphony. That is the premiere of the 9th Symphony. 3 movements from New Mass. That was the Vienna premiere of the Missa Solemnis, 3 movements of it, which had premiered a few weeks earlier here in St. Petersburg, the complete Missa Solemnis, and a new overture. That's the consecration of the house overture. God willing, I too am thinking of giving a similar concert the next year. So this is March 1824. Didn't happen in 1825. The Beethoven concert was in May 1824, and this is the grand overture. 3 wasn't allowed to be called a mass because it was a public concert, so it's all 3 big hymns, and the symphony with chorus, the 9th Symphony. So the next year, 1825, no concert. 26, 1827, March is when Beethoven dies, but finally in March 1828, is when Schubert does give this concert that he had been wanting to give for at least 4 years, a public Schubertiad, as he called it. And it was a sort of typical program of the time in that it mixed together different things. As I said, I recreated this in New York, the 92nd Street Y, and we did it at Bard a few years ago as well. It's an expensive thing to do these days because it's the first movement of a string quartet. So we hired the Tokyo String Quartet to play 12 minutes of music. The managers don't give you a discount if they play fewer notes on a concert. You know, you're hiring a string quartet and a piano trio and a chorus and different singers. So it began with the first movement of a new string quartet. Then Johann Michael Vogel, the leading baritone, the one who sort of discovered Schubert, the Fischer-Dieskau of Vienna, sang 4-liter with Schubert accompanying. Then the Serenade Stenchen with a poem by Grillparzer was sung by a woman, a soprano, and students from the conservatory, female students from the conservatory. Then the premiere of the E-flat piano trio was the centerpiece of the concert. That's the piece that I think was the memorial homage to Beethoven. Then Auf dem Strom, which is for piano and French horn and baritone. This quotes from the Eroica Symphony. It quotes the funeral march of the Eroica. Then another song, the Allmacht, and then it ended with a double chorus, a men's chorus, to a Klopstock poem. So I could go on at enormous length now about the E-flat trio and why, and to convince you that this is a piece that is written to say farewell to Beethoven. I will just play some tantalizing things, perhaps, from it. We know, and it's been known for over 100 years, that Schubert made use of a Swedish folk song in the concerto. So many of his own pieces, the Trout Quintet, the Wander Fantasy, he made use of one of his own songs. In this, he makes use of a song that a friend from Sweden had taught him earlier in the year. And what's relevant here is that the falling octave motive that is so prominent in this is connected with the words farewell, farewell. So let me just play the very beginning of the second movement of the trio, then a little bit of the beginning of the song, and this will give you a taste of it, I guess. Same key, rhythm, melodic contour as the funeral march of the Eroica. Farewell to Beethoven here. That's where the importance of this octave motive in particular comes, but there are other connections as well. There are a lot of things with the eroica here, the words to song and harmonic things. This could go on at some length, but just to maybe make it a little bit more concrete, here's a passage from the end of the eroica, if you listen to the flute and the violin, and then the very end of the trio, if you listen to the piano, it's note for note the same thing. So this is not an allusion, this is a quotation, and then there's the final farewell, farewell octaves to end. So here's the eroica. And if you may remember, this theme, this wonderful cello theme of the second movement, comes back 3 times in the finale, in the last movement. So this is, of course, Beethovenian cyclicism that would happen a lot more later in the 19th century, but was quite unusual. It's what Beethoven had done in the 5th Symphony and the 9th Symphony and other compositions, but was totally a Beethovenian thing to do. The one other final musical excerpt I'll play is there are sketches that survive for this piece. Rather unusually with Schubert, but at the end of his life he didn't have time to throw it away. So we have sketches for this and for the last 3 piano sonatas. Usually for Schubert works we don't. So here's something that didn't make it into the trio and it's been reconstructed from the sketch. Obvious to quote there, so he gets rid of that. It has to be kept more on the element of illusion. So as I say, I could, and I've been going on for 20 years about it, so I won't go on anymore here of the argument, read the article, buy the book eventually when it comes out, but the case that I'm actually trying to make shows something of the importance, particular importance of Beethoven, of Beethoven's death for Schubert, but also is revealing of the way he works. What he's doing here of sort of encoding things is not the obvious Trout quintet. These are secrets here. This is what Alban Berg later would do. This is what Shostakovich would do, and so forth. This has private meanings for him, and maybe only for him. Maybe a few friends would get the illusions, maybe like with Robert Schumann or Brahms and Clara Wieck. So I think there's a much more private side to Schubert's quotation of songs and allusions in his work than is usually recognized. So for the coda here, let me just wrap up maybe the death story a little bit. The concert was very successful, made Schubert money. He got rich enough that he could go 3 days later and take a friend to hear Paganini's debut in Vienna. In the space between Beethoven's death and Schubert's 20 months later is maybe the most extraordinary 20 months in the history of a musician, of what he produced. If you think of the last string quartets, the last 3 piano sonatas, Winterreise, Schwanengesang, the E-flat trio, the C major string quintet, the E-flat mass, the last 3 piano duos, and so forth and so on. It's an extraordinary quantity of work, but in 20 months to write that quality of work is beyond belief. So 20 months later, Schubert did die, and this was the final letter that he wrote to his friend Schubert just 9 days before he died, where he says how ill he is, and he wants books. He said, "I've read James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, The Spy, The Pilot, and The Pioneers. If by chance you have anything else of his, I beg you to leave it for me at the coffee shop." So James Fenimore Cooper is how Schubert's, in German translation, spent his last days of cowboys and Indians and so forth. This is a letter that Ferdinand, he died in Ferdinand's apartment, it's now a museum in Vienna, where Ferdinand says that he believes that Schubert's last wish was that he be buried next to Beethoven. This is a letter that Ferdinand wrote to their father, Franz Schubert Sr. And that's more or less what happened. The space next door, so to speak, was not available. So you see Beethoven's monument here, and all the way on the other side is Schubert's. The O'Donnell and the Hartmut families are in between. When Robert Schumann first came to Vienna, he went there and wrote to Clara that he envied the people between Beethoven and Schubert. This is the way it looks today, because this Währing cemetery was deconsecrated in 1888, and the bodies of everybody was moved, well, not the commoners, those bodies just were not moved, but in grand ceremonies, the bodies of Beethoven and Schubert were transferred to the central cemetery where they are today. This is Schubert's grave. I'll show it to you in a better photo. Already some years earlier, in 1863, their bodies had been dug up to be put into metal caskets. And this is a fascinating anthropological report, a report of the Anthropological Society of Vienna, where they compare the skulls of Beethoven and Schubert. And this was popular at the time, phrenology. Hegel writes about it in the Phenomenology of Spirit and so forth. So, and you know, this is just like ridiculous non-science, right? But you would actually have in this report that the skull of Schubert is like his music, is feminine, and Beethoven's skull is masculine and like his music. It's absolutely fantastic. This is Schubert's grave, which has the notorious epigraph, which was written by Grillparzer, the poet. The art of music here entombs a rich possession, but even far fairer hopes. So the idea is that yes, he was great, but what about if he had lived longer? There was even greater hopes that would have emerged. Franz Schubert, and then his age, he dies at the age of 31. Of course, they didn't know most of the great music that it took the rest of the century to be revealed, to be published. 10 years later is the last three sonatas, and Mendelssohn conducts the premiere of the C major symphony, and 1865 for the unfinished symphony, and 1852 for the C major quintet. As I say, bodies were moved in 1888, and this is where they are today in the central cemetery. So I would say that even just of focusing on this one issue of this one piece and the last year of Schubert's life has opened up many things that I think are important about Schubert's biography during this sort of micro-history and really history mixed with some analysis that reveals other things and makes me look for different types of things and actually find documents. I mean, it's hard to do new and I would say, you know, make new discoveries about Beethoven and Schubert. These are fairly well-known composers. But I wanted to find out about what was happening the week of Schubert's concert and what the other concerts were and why Ignaz Szczepanik, the violinist, didn't play at Schubert's concert. And so this was the concert given 3 days before Beethoven's in the same location. It was the premiere of Beethoven's last string quartet, the F major quartet, opus 135, with the motto, muss es sein, es muss sein. And this is, which is even there. So this is the program for that concert. And I found this has never been published. Well, it's published in my article. So it's like people haven't even looked for or think is important what the premiere of Beethoven's last piece is. And they don't get right which musicians were performing on the concert. And if you know where all these concerts were and what was being performed, a lot of the things in the conversation books make more sense, and you can date things in the conversation books because I know what Szczepanik was playing on his quartet concert. This is Ignat Szczepanik, the violinist who premiered these pieces, and why I was asking this question. And even this goes in another direction, because I've recreated with John Gingrich every concert that Szczepanik gave with his quartet since he returned from Petersburg when Prince Razumovsky's palace burned down in Christmas Day, 1816. He came to St. Petersburg. That's why Golitsyn commissioned the late quartets of Beethoven. That's why I think the premiere of the Missa Solemnis took place here. In 1823, he went back to Vienna, and he gave 24 concerts a year. He invented the idea of the subscription chamber music concert with a professional string quartet. So I found every one of these programs. This has taken 15 years to do. And I gave this to the cellist of the Emerson String Quartet, David Finkel, who runs the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. They play here this summer. And this March, they're recreating 4 of the concerts because he got interested in what these connections were. So I've got a little program book for that. I'm writing the program notes. I'll give a pre-concert talk. But even it will sort of introduce New York City audiences to the chamber musicians that premiered Beethoven's music. We're even going to put like the stupid artist bios that you get when you go to concerts that tell you, what violin they play and what conservatory they went to. I'm going to write sort of parody ones. It'll be factual, but I'll write the bios for these guys as well. So that's some examples of these small, of what microhistories I think can do that, for me, have been a great benefit from be it a dissertation or the piano trio, opened up much larger things. But also, when I did the Taruskin book, or when I write a program note on a symphony, the types of questions that I ask, even though I can't become an expert on it, I think that making me see the small picture has helped me greatly when I'm looking at the big picture. So, thank you.
Just to follow up on your discussion with Beethoven and Schubert, I recall read at this point that you addressed this problem in your articles and chapters, but still we had this knowledge media grown, please clarify that Beethoven once actually assessed Schubert in one of his articles about his own side of Schubert. Is that true, or is it such mistaken information narrated in the Russian scholarship?
So what was the...